Brexit came about, in my view, first and foremost because of leadership failures. We can debate this a little later, and maybe it needs diluting. But when you look back over the last few years and the policies pursued by a series of British leaders, starting with David Cameron, the previous Prime Minister, and his decision to call a referendum in 2016. He had promised that in the previous election campaign, but he never thought he would have to carry out this project. He never expected to win the election. He thought that probably he'd have to form another coalition with the Liberal Democrats, who are pro-European, and who would have prevented a referendum from taking place. And he probably thought also that if there were a referendum in the end, he would win it, just as the referendum in Scotland on independence had been won by those in favour of keeping the United Kingdom together. So the first leadership failure was his disastrous and unnecessary decision to call the referendum. The second failure was Theresa May's bungled approach to the negotiations. We can see now that she committed a series of fundamental errors. You know, at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I'm teaching, we have a module on negotiating technique. And what you don't do at the very, very beginning, before the negotiations have even begun, is to reveal your bottom line to your negotiating partner. And quite unnecessarily, at the beginning of this process, she laid down red lines. No jurisdiction in the future for the European Court of Justice. No significant payments into the EU budget. No participation in the single market. No participation in the customs union after Brexit. And having laid down those red lines, there was almost nothing left to negotiate, and her hands were tied. So I think she made any number of errors for similar motives to those of David Cameron. And then Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, also carries a very heavy responsibility for what has taken place. He remained ambiguous throughout. If early on he'd taken a clear position, either in the referendum campaign itself against leaving the European Union, or subsequently in favour of a soft Brexit, in which the UK would remain part of the single market, then the outcome would have been very different. I think that another factor that contributed to the outcome was what I'm calling defective democracy. The Remain campaign was very poorly led, with no clear message, no vision as to why it was in the interest of the United Kingdom to remain part of the European Union. Instead, this was described by some as Project Fear, arousing fears about the consequences of leaving, not giving a positive vision as to the benefits. What can we expect in the years ahead? Political fragmentation is a reality. The EU member states and the European Parliament will no longer be dominated by the three main parties that have been active until now. The questions we must ask: will Macron, who for the time being is the de facto leader in the absence of any other of Europe, will he succeed with at least some of his reforms? Will the EU prove resilient? Will it be able to deal with these different cross-cutting pressures? And will these new leaders that I introduced you very briefly rise to the challenge? So I'm leaving you with questions rather than answers.